On this episode of the Home Studio Hangout podcast, we have founder of Access Analog, Chris Barrett. If you don't know about Access Analog, they're leading the way in combining the world of robotics and analog audio gear.
I remember the first time we recalled a preset and we heard all the robotics move. That was kind of a jump up and down type of moment.
Chris talks about how through their cloud streaming plugin, they're not only making this analog gear accessible to home studios in America, but also across the world.
Some countries, do have access to this equipment, but there's quite a few where essentially what they say is, as expensive as we think this equipment is, it's even more expensive to have to import it to a different country.
We also talk about how Chris pushed himself into learning new things in order to make this even possible.
I think there are times where you get stuck and it's frustrating and you're thinking, why am I doing this? This sucks. It's just kind of teaching yourself to get through those periods so that you can enjoy the rest of it,
We want to make sure you guys have the ability to check out this awesome software, so stay tuned till the end of the episode for a special treat just for Home Studio Hangout listeners. Let's get into it. And welcome back to the Home Studio Hangout podcast. I am your host, Drew, not here with my co-host, Josh, but I am joined today by Chris Barrett, founder and CEO of Access Analog. Chris, I'm super excited to have you here on the podcast with us today.
Great to be here.
Yeah, and talk about everything Access Analog and what you guys do over there and a little bit about you so people could get to know you better as well. So maybe to start, let's start with who you are and what is Access Analog.
Sure, yeah. I am kind of a cross between kind of a tech engineer, software engineer, and hardware, and a musician. So I've been in bands and played guitar since fifth grade. Played guitar for a long time, and so those two worlds have been separate from me for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Up until about 2000, when this project started, which was 2015. And I had this idea and realized maybe I can kind of combine these two worlds. So that's kind of where it all started, was in 2015 when I did that. And then so
the idea
with
of Access Analog started in 2015?
Yeah, that's right. The very first idea, and it may have actually been 2014, but it was one of those cases where you have an idea. And I am a bit of an entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur type of person that wants to always think about problems and think about solutions. And so I had been doing this, and usually I could shoot down my ideas pretty quick on why they wouldn't work. But this one stuck. And there were some unknowns, certainly. But if I could figure out some of those unknowns, then I couldn't think of a reason why it wouldn't work ultimately. And so that's kind of what got me going on, trying it out. And kind of my famous story of when I first tried it out, I had no idea if it was going to work. So I needed a piece of analog equipment. I didn't have one, and I didn't want to invest a ton in, because I had no idea if it was just going to be a little science project or whatever. So I bought the Warm Audio EQ-PWA, which is also relatively simple. It's got some knobs, no meters or anything like that.
Yeah.
And so I just kind of beat that thing up, trying things out and trying to figure out how to turn the knobs. And I was okay with if I tore it up because it was not too expensive. So that's kind of where it all started.
That's awesome, man. And now, so from the starting point of, grabbing this first piece of Warm Audio gear into now, you've kind of grown this thing into something a lot bigger. Is this kind of where you expected it to go whenever you kind of started this thing, or do you now see it potentially getting even bigger, or is this kind of where you've dreamt it would be whenever you kind of had that initial idea?
Yeah, those are good questions. No, I think in the beginning, I wasn't sure if it was something that was desirable. I know that the equipment is desirable,
Mm-hmm.
And we kept telling ourselves, right, if people want the equipment and we're able to make it accessible, it should work, right? Like people actually would want to use that. We couldn't
Yeah.
really, you never really know until you enter the market and then you find out whether people really want it or not.
100%.
You could ask your buddy, you know, and you can ask certain people and they'll go, oh, yeah, that sounds great. That sounds like a great product. And so we did a lot of that and just kind of second guessing ourselves. Meanwhile, we were trying to get it to where we could actually, you know, launch it as a product. And,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I kind of learned through this process that getting it to work once was maybe a year and a half or year and a half to get it to work once, kind of all the way through the
Yeah.
audio and the control. And then getting it to work, you know, 99% of the time is much harder, much harder,
Yeah.
to where it's essentially bulletproof. So once we just kind of sorted out, yeah, this is a product and people do want it. We got it to where we launched it, and like you said, it's grown, and we keep adding more gear. We kind of now we just kind
Yeah.
of cranking the engine, get more gear, get more customers, get more gear, get more customers, and we're
Mm-hmm.
still in the middle of that.
Yeah.
Eventually, we realized that subscriptions made a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
That was not something we had in the beginning. There were a lot of things we didn't have in the beginning. We didn't have, you could only do one device. Like you could just run your audio through one device. Then we added the ability to chain together multiple
To
devices.
build the chains. Yeah.
Yeah, presets and things. There's all. I remember the first time we recalled a preset and we heard all the robotics move. That was kind of a jump up and down type of moment. Just
Yeah, man.
lots of fun all the way through. But it's amazing how many different things we think of and go, oh, wow, we could add that on. And it just adds such a
Mm-hmm.
big dimension to the product.
So for the people who the uninitiated or the people that may have never heard for you before, this is a pretty new thing. What you do is a pretty new thing. And I had heard about it through a mutual on, I believe it was on TikTok. I had a mutual on there, and he and I had spoken about it a couple times, and he's the one that kind of introduced us. And so I think for the people who have no clue of what this is, in the most layman's terms, let's explain it to those producers and engineers who definitely would be interested in this.
Yeah, it's good. We should get that out of the way. So Access Analog takes a lot of the rack mount gear that you would find in a music studio, that 1176s or LA2As or any of this type of rack mount hardware that we use for music production and other stuff as well. That gear, we put it in at our location. That's what's behind me. And then we put a bunch of robotics on the front of it to control it. And then we give you, the customer, a plugin. And the plugin doesn't do anything other than stream audio across the internet and through this gear and back to you. So it performs like a plugin, it behaves like a plugin, and it's familiar like that. But when you're turning the software knob in the plugin, you're turning the physical knob in real time of this gear. And so you essentially have remote control of all of this gear, and you can chain it together or make presets like we were talking about earlier. And ultimately you can use the gear, and then when you're done kind of at the end of your session of using the gear, you can bounce the result and you walk away with processed audio with real analog gear, and you can import that in your DAW or whatever.
Yeah, and I see that being obviously incredibly helpful, especially with the home studio, boom of the last, we'll say 5 to 7 years, right? Like the explosion of home studios, and like most producers that used to rent out these massive studios now moving into their own spaces, maybe in their house or in like a compound with a bunch of other producers. And so they may not necessarily have access to a massive passive, right? Like a manly massive passive that might be a part of their master bus. I know that's a pretty common one on their 2 bus, right? So or maybe they don't have their Avalon or what have you, these weird niche specific pieces of gear that a lot of people build their careers on their vocal chain, and maybe they don't have access to that anymore. They just can't afford it, or it was like a one of one in that room, like it's a less easily accessible piece of gear now that you guys have the accessibility to through the internet, and they can continue to use that like it never even left.
Yeah, definitely. Ease of access is one of the huge benefits. Even people that own the gear, kind of want to be able to access their gear from more than one location.
Mm-hmm.
And so we get requests for people that are like, can you just do that to my gear and then make it to where I can use it from anywhere? And the answer is, yeah, we can, but it's kind of all a custom job. And,
Sure.
and so we haven't figured out how to make that economically viable,
Yeah.
but it's kind of a side thing and those people also want to be able to have presets. So even people that go out and buy this expensive gear, they don't have the benefit of presets that we have, and recall as well. So when you open your DAW session and you were using the plugin before with a massive passive, when you open that massive passive again in the DAW, it goes back to the settings that you had it before.
Yeah.
And you can continue from there. So a lot of good major benefits. Obviously the one thing we don't have is the tactile feel of the knobs. You don't get that through our service, but we think you get everything else.
Yeah. No, that's and that's incredible. And so, and you're using robotic arms and knob, like you're using pieces of robotic gear essentially that's placed on every aspect of the faceplate to then that is what when they are turning the threshold, it is corresponding to the threshold motor on that gear and then turning that threshold knob accordingly.
That's correct. We have motors on every knob. We have these solenoids on the buttons, and we have motors on switches. So that kind of narrows down the types of controls that exist on this equipment. It's knobs, buttons, and switches. And so we tackled those three, and we have the robotics, as you can see here in the background, like all these tiny rectangular things are motors. In fact, this is, well, I'm not sure what piece that is, but I think that's part of Brian Lucy's Magic Garden rig, which we'll talk about some of the mastering changes we have.
Yeah.
And so, we put the robotics on there so that every control that's on the real device, this is what we aspire to. We want you to have control of that, unless it makes completely no sense. Like if it's a switch for a side chain, an external side chain that we don't have hooked up, then we won't put that switch. We won't control that switch. And then another corollary to this is that there's the meters on the equipment, and we want you to be able to have the real, as much of the real meter as you can. And so what we've done is put cameras on the meters, and we track the meters, and we relay that tracking to the plugins. So the meter you're seeing in the plugin, the movement is tracked from the real equipment. So you're getting the real meter.
That's incredibly impressive. I actually did not even realize that whenever I was like watching videos about this and stuff. I didn't, in my mind, it was just like an input thing, or like, it was like a feed based off of whatever was happening. It wasn't necessarily like a real time camera, like based on what the meter is actually doing in the unit.
Yeah, we tried it. That was one thing we really wanted to do, is have no simulation in any of this. This is where you go to get real hardware, not any type of emulation. So we wanted to stay true to that principle. And then the other thing was that we didn't want to open the unit up. We didn't want to alter the unit in any way, which led us down the path of doing robotics. And it's the only way to be on the outside of the unit and provide control. And so that's kind of
without changing any of the internal infrastructure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense actually, because and especially when you start getting into like a lot of older pieces or more vintage, like it's very specific pieces, like you start messing with internals that can drastically change every aspect to what happens to the audio as it passes through everything.
Yeah,
like
it all interacts.
Yeah. Uh,
Yeah, so you can see where if
the
you tried to change one piece in there in order to be able to control it, you end up changing the whole subsystem. So we just wanted to stay out of the box.
Yeah, no, that's incredibly impressive. Well, it's also impressive that you were able to do it. And like as I look through just the things that you offer, another place that this is like very, very cool for is, we talk a lot about on the podcast, we've talked a lot about like people getting hands-on experience with a lot of rack gear, and I know that's not always possible, but I like to tell people it's good to have hands-on experience with rack gear, like the real pieces that you use plug-in versions of, because you need to know how that real unit reacts to an incoming source of audio, whether it's a vocal or a drum bus or master bus or whatever. Like having that, an understanding that initial thing can then like help you make better decisions, whether you're using a plug-in version or you're going to another room and you use a real version of that. So you've now made that accessible to the people that are kind of coming up, that a lot of people aren't going to have the opportunity to go to. Like I learned in a large format studio. I learned on a large format console, an SSL 9000J, with a room that was full of rack gear, and I had the ability to just plug and play at my heart's content. I recognize that I am very lucky, and very few people get that opportunity, especially when you're like in the middle of the country where there are a lot less large studios, and you're not on one of the coasts where all of the like a lot of the music happens. Well,
Yeah, or
Nashville,
even worse.
Atlanta, New York.
Yeah, or worse yet, you're international. Some countries, do have access to this equipment, but there's quite a few where essentially what they say is as much as expensive as we think this equipment is, it's even more expensive to have to import it to a different country. So
Oh yeah. I didn't even think about that. That's a very good insight. And yeah, and you guys are, because you're online based, you're international, correct?
that's right. Yeah.
So you've opened up the rest of the world to being able to use some of this, like we've been saying massive passive, but that's a very sought after piece of gear. A lot of people like that EQ, like that's a very good example of a piece of gear that not a lot of people will ever be able to actually touch, because it is on the upper echelon of nice pieces of gear.
Yeah.
But now you've instantly made it accessible for, I think that one's $11.74 for 30 minutes, so like 22-23 bucks for an hour with it, to pass as much as you want through and mess around with it and see how it works and see.
Yeah, and we have subscriptions where you could get a subscription to that device or a set of 2 or 3 devices or whatever, and then the value goes up even more on the subscription. And then the other thing that's kind of fun to talk about, the use case of someone who is thinking about buying a massive passive, and they just they need to hear it. They need to hear it on their own system, figure out how to use it, and kind of go, yeah, I really love this device. I'm going to go buy this. So
Yeah, and they
we're
don't
happy
live
to.
near Vintage King
Yeah,
or Sweetwater or some of these larger places, and because those are, I mean, of a place that would actually have something like a massive passive or at that level, you're talking
right.
maybe 5 or 6 places in the country that aren't studios.
Yeah,
Maybe.
yeah. And even if you did, going into Vintage King and in their showroom and trying to make a decision there is a lot harder than in your own studio,
Yeah.
where you're going to be using the device. So we love to try to help facilitate. We think all of these manufacturers are super awesome, and we want to support them. And we're happy to facilitate that. We call it try before buy.
Yeah.
Customer as well.
Yeah, that's an incredible use case, honestly, because like I'm 90% in the box. I track on the way in with a lot of stuff. But in the mix stage, I am majoritively in the box. And yeah, like if I were to want to buy some sort of 2 bus piece of gear, like that's going to be really hard for me to try literally anywhere else except for my space. And Like, because, especially, I mean, I think that's a really good, actually, probably the best example of when that comes in the most handy, right? Is
Yeah,
on your master bus, if you're mixing and your mix scenario, like you as a mix engineer, being able to try it in your space, in your room, in your scenario, with your mix on your master bus, with your chain, like it's hard outside of that to know before you drop 15 grand on a piece of rack gear sometimes, if we're talking like Shadow Hills or something like that,
right.
uh like the ability to make that instantly accessible, you're correct, is incredibly unique uh to a lot of people. But then also they may decide that they don't necessarily need to buy it because they prefer the flexibility of using something like Access Analog, because that one piece of gear might not work for every single use case that they are going for. So now you've
Yeah,
opened up the flexibility as well.
yeah. You could see somebody make some decisions to use Access Analog on certain gear, but then other gear they really like, they want to purchase that gear. And then, of course, the way this is all set up as a plugin, you can use both of those together. You can use your personal gear along with our gear, along with the software plugin, and combine it however you want.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. So I would love for you to maybe talk through, because you mentioned the subscription stuff and the pricing model. I would love to hear kind of a full explanation of that for people that might be super interested in this as well.
Yeah. So we think of it as we have three main ways that you can use the system and kind of pay to use the system. There's well actually four, I guess. So first at a first level, we always recommend. There's a couple of devices we have that are always free. So the Dayking Comp 2 and the Iron Age EQ. So Iron Age is a small manufacturer, and they
Yeah.
have an EQ that we have here. Sounds great. Um, and so those devices, because they're always free, those are perfect devices to just try things. Understand how the plugin works. There is some latency because it takes time to get audio across the internet and
Yeah.
back. There's a 1 or 2 second latency in there, so you can kind of get a feel for that and figure out how it's gonna work for you. So we always recommend you need an account, so you just go to accessanalog.com and get your free account, and then once you have the account, you download the plugin, and you can't. I mean, the website has a whole reservation system where you can reserve equipment. You can do that with the free devices if you want, but you can. It's really easier to just download the plugin, connect with your account credentials, and you can just use equipment what we call on demand. So as long as no one else is using it and it's not reserved, you can just grab it and use it, and
Yeah.
that applies to the free devices as well. So it really becomes that simple. Um, is just creating the free account, download the plugin, and try those devices. And then once you've used the devices, you got a feel for how things work. Then you can look at trying to use some of the paid gear. And so we have a credit system. So you go to the website and you just buy credits. And I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned this on-demand way of using the system. That's kind of what credits facilitate. You buy your credits and do the thing on the website, and then in the plugin you have your credits, and then you just use gear as it's available. Usually it's available, but you can put this device in, put that device in, and your credits are kind of shown in the plugin, and they tick down at the hourly rate of the equipment, whatever the hourly reservation rate is.
Mm-hmm.
That's how much the credit cost is. So it's all the same whether you reserve or use on demand. It's roughly the same cost. And just the credit system is just super flexible because you can use a device for 10 minutes, bounce your result. Maybe you've used it before, so you have a preset. You just insert the device, recall your preset, bounce your result, and you're out in like 8 or 10 minutes. And the cost of that is negligible. It's very small. And so
Yeah.
you just have these credits that kind of slowly get used over time. And then we have um, subscriptions around those credits, where you can get credits on a monthly basis and get a better value for the credits. Um, then we have a set of subscriptions that allow you, if you have certain pieces of gear that you prefer and you just want to use those pieces of gear, we have some what we call Analog Explorer subscriptions that allow you to pick like 5 devices that you love and you get a substantial amount of time on those 5 devices for a monthly fee. And we have that for 1, 3, 5, 7 devices, and I think 10 devices. So we have a whole family of those subscriptions. Then we have our ultimate subscription, which is unlimited time on everything you see behind me, everything on this set of racks. We should also talk about that we have racks elsewhere in the world. We'll get to that in a second.
Yeah.
And so we have the ultimate subscription, and then finally we have subscriptions around these mastering chains. So some of these racks, like this one right here, is a professionally designed mastering chain by a professional mastering engineer. In this case, it's Brian Lucy, and then over here we have one by Pete Lyman. And these guys have produced, pro-level audio recordings with this exact equipment. We just made a copy of their exact chain, and you connect to it, and you run your audio through the entire chain as one. It's almost like one device, except there's obviously 8 devices. So we have subscriptions to those chains as well. And then,
yeah, that's incredible, man. I love the chain aspect of that too, because that's, especially if you're like, oh, well, I want to try something tried and true, right? I want to try something that, a combination of things that I know will work on somebody who, works at that super high level, like Grammy nominated mastering engineers. Like, you got that built in.
That's right. And they've set it up to have, some presets that you start from that are almost infallible. Like, just start here and things are automatically going to sound incredible. And then you can tweak from there. But you get not only the equipment, but you get all of their knowledge through those presets.
That's incredible, man. So let's talk about like the gear specifically. How many pieces are you guys running total? And let's say like total first, and then we'll talk about like where everything is.
Yeah, I should know that answer, but because it changes.
It can be a rough number. It doesn't have to be exact.
Yeah, I think it's like 40 devices here. Then the mastering chains, we have 2 of those here, and they're roughly 7 or 8 devices each. And then we have a rack kind of like this with individual pieces of gear. It's not a chain. We have a rack in Sweden with Palma Studio, which is a studio in Sweden, in Kalmar, Sweden. And so they have a rack like this, and they have like 8 to 10 pieces of gear, something like that. So it's the same plugin that you use for all of these. The plugin, you pick what you want to connect to in the plugin before you connect. And so there's the main Access analog gear that's this right here. Then there's each one of those chains back there, the mastering chains. Those are different things to connect to. And then there's the thing in Sweden.
Yeah. So, okay. So you mentioned the Sweden thing. How was that connection made, and how did you decide like, oh, we can expand into that area? And also like that's incredibly amazing that the internet allows you to just like have that available. That's wild to me. Just like thinking like growing up, I grew up we grew up pre-internet age. So the fact that like that is a thing that can happen just at will, basically, barring maybe a couple 2 or 3 seconds of latency, is pretty crazy. So how did you make that connection though in Sweden, and why did you decide to expand into that studio specifically?
Yeah, it's a good question. We want to eventually, in the big long-term view, we would like to have servers that are closer to where people are, so that they have less latency and maybe a different kind of gear, because you kind of see different focus in different parts of the world. Like Europe has their manufacturers, and the people in Europe tend to use the manufacturers in Europe, and the people in the United States tend to use the manufacturers in the United States. So we kind of like that difference in flavor that goes on around the world. And so we just thought, it's certainly technically possible to have these different racks around the world. Why not try it? So we did, and we partnered with these guys in Sweden. and a great group of guys. And we set the rack up there. And the funny story is that by that time I had been using, this was all working, and I had been using this gear, testing things, and it's right behind me. So I hear when all the robotics change and all that stuff. And I got kind of used to the fact that I'm using a cool system, but the system's right behind me. So yeah, it's cool, but it's not like I didn't
But you can still
realize I was
see it.
missing.
Like you can still
Yeah, I
see
can still
everything
see it.
happening.
Yeah. And I didn't realize that there's an aspect of that until the Sweden server was up and running and I connected to the Sweden server. I felt the real experience of holy cow, I'm using this, this compressor, and it's on the other side of the world.
Yeah, and you felt the true user experience in that moment of like what you were going to be able to give to people. Oh yeah, I bet that was incredible too.
Yeah, it was. I was like, it's just I had to step back and kind of think, wow, this really is pretty cool, So, so I had that experience, and the Sweden server thing has worked out great, and we hope to keep expanding it. And yeah, that's kind of it.
Yeah, no, that's really sick. How long have you been sending, getting stuff over there, and when was that kind of partnership established?
Yeah, it was maybe about a year and a half, 2 years ago when it first started getting rolling, and then
Okay.
they added gear over time. There's one coming there. They've got an Elysia EQ coming that we're excited about. So
that's the other thing that I was thinking about, because yeah, you're right. Like the more I think about it, like we here in the States get very particular pieces of gear, and I'm sure that there's a lot of weird pieces especially in like Sweden and like that area of Europe that's known for a bunch of crazy records, a lot of like doom and death metal, and like they're known for that kind of music, but also like the pop side of things as well. Like they're kind of known for the two extremes of music, I would argue, and EDM. But I'm sure they get rat gear that we've never touched that are probably like hyper unique pieces that now we have access to.
Yeah, they do. And I met some of these manufacturers you're talking about. Like there's one in Denmark. There's Giraffe Audio, super awesome guy. Yeah, there's these boutique manufacturers all over the world. It's just amazing the amount of the equipment they put out and how it's just incredible.
Yeah. What's one that blew you? Have you had one blow you away yet? That of like a piece of gear that you were like, I've never heard of this, and this is amazing.
Yeah, one of them it's a unit called a Strom 1660 in the Sweden rack, which is this enormous tank of a device that's kind of modeled after, I think, the Fairchild 660. And it's just an amazing device. And then, very few people know about it. Very few people buy these Strom devices, and they come from a historical background in Sweden. The people who've been making them have been making them for a while. So it's just amazing to find something like that. And you're like, wow, I can't believe this device exists, and not that many people know about it.
Yeah, no, that just opens you up to a whole new world. And like you said, the more you guys expand into other parts of the world, right? Because I'm sure that is also the case, probably for like more far east, like in Japan. I'm sure there's a lot of units over there that like we've never seen, or like maybe in like Korea or in some of the the further western parts of the world where they do records over there. I'm sure there's a ton of pieces of gear over there that we've never seen.
Yeah, it'd be amazing to see what they have.
Yeah. So diving back into like the gear itself, you said you had, I think, from what I counted, it was roughly like 50 or 60 currently different pieces of gear. I think that's what you said, roughly.
Yeah.
Of those pieces of gear, what was one that when you got it was like, oh, this is a moment. Like this is like a pretty big, we're definitely moving into this thing now. You know what I mean? Like that. Yeah. That memorable moment,
Yeah. It was kind of a moment like that, and a little bit of a story with the Massive Passive, because we got it initially fairly early on, maybe our 30th device or 25th device, something around that range. And it kind of terrified me. Like I looked at it and I was like, how am I going to be able to to do all of this, And at the
Yeah.
time, with what I kind of knew how to do with robotics, I kind of just stared at it for like a week or two and thought and thought and thought. And eventually I was like, you know what? This is like over my head for right now. Like, this is too much. I could be making progress on other devices if I didn't have to spend so much time on this device. So essentially, I gave up. It's the only time I've given up on a device. And
Jeez.
I said it,
Well,
we,
to be fair,
we,
that one has like for like 20 knobs in one unit or something like that. It's a lot of stuff, and like
yeah,
they're all different
it's got,
sizes.
yeah, it's got these little switches at the top that are really
Yeah,
tiny. And
and the center knobs are like an eighth of the size of the main knobs, like the EQ parts.
yeah, so I gave up and we sent it back. And then, a year or two goes by and we were like, you know what, we should really have a massive passive. And I was like, we tried that one time, but now with what I know now, probably could do it. And sure enough, we got one and built it. And so after building that and doing some presets on it, which sound amazing because the robotics all go crazy. That was pretty fun. That was
No, that's really. What do you find are like the most used pieces?
The Rupert Neve Designs stuff is highly used. The master bus processor. So we have kind of a policy where we try to monitor, and when a device gets used a certain amount of time, roughly 30% of the time, if a device is being used, we want to buy another of that device. We want to make sure there's always time available for people to use the devices. And so those are the units where we have to pay close attention because they get used a lot.
Yeah,
that kind of
I can see like the classics being pretty normal, like your G comps and your the 5059 is really interesting too.
Yeah, I was going to mention that's our newest device. So that required a lot of software because the 5059 is a summing unit. So analog summing, it has 16 inputs and 2 outs, just for everyone to kind of get on the same page. And so we don't have a 16 input device. We never had one. And we kind of realized, well, it's going to be hard to stream 16 channels of audio up to the device. So we kind of said, well, let's just do it as an upload type of thing. So if you have 16 stems, instead of doing them real time on the upload, let's just have you upload those 16 stems first. And then once they're uploaded, you can play and you can turn the knobs and do your mix in real time, like we've talked about before. Yeah. Your stems are being stored here at the server, and then you kind of do your mix that way. So
and they get
all of that is kind of all of that's kind of quite different for us. And so we had to do a whole big revision of our plugin, which we just got done with all of that, and the summing unit is now available.
Yeah, I saw it. It's on the top of the list here, and I was really interested in how that worked because I was like, that's a summing mixer. That's like not a normal piece of gear. So I was but now that is set up, that also now opens up all of the summing mixers in the world to be added potentially to your list down the line. You're not saying no to those pieces now. At least you're looking at them as potentials.
That's right. We would love to expand with some more summing mixers. The other cool thing that we wanted is for it to be a device in the same rack and same service as the other devices, so that you can put the summing mixer in, and then on that output stereo bus, you can put your G comp or whatever else you want to put to really get an impressive mix out of that.
No, and you're becoming a mastering engineer's haven. Especially in their own spaces, because it just alleviates a lot of stuff. I mean, like you said, you guys are adding stuff constantly and you're innovating with the 5059. Like, I am very impressed with all of that. I want to take one step back and be like, how did you learn all these robotics things, man? Because like did you have to teach yourself all of this? Did you have a background in this? Like, that's because you said you had a background in audio and kind of a little bit of, engineering and production stuff, but like the robotics side is a totally different world from all of those things.
Yeah, that's a good question. For me personally, it matters. It's where I spend a lot of my time thinking is I my degree is in electrical engineering, so I'm definitely a technical engineer type of person. And
Yeah.
I've done software for quite a while, although much simpler software than what I'm doing here. So the first leap was just expanding software wise to what I needed to do in order to do this. So that was kind of a big learning curve, and I did all that. We'll call that back in 2016, roughly. And then, yeah, you're right that there were two more elements here. That's the physical or mechanical engineering part with all the
Yeah.
robotics. I had to learn all that from scratch. I really didn't have any experience in that at all,
My
other than
gosh.
tangentially. And so,
You're
so
a
you know,
trooper, bro. That's crazy.
yeah, yeah. Learning stuff like that is difficult at times and frustrating at times. But I
Hmm.
find that overall, when you go learn something like that, and you've done it in audio, I'm sure, you get to the other side of it and you have this skill and now you can apply it and you're affecting the world with this skill. It just kind
100%.
of snowballs and you keep wanting to do that and you keep learning more. And so there's an electrical part of this as well. As you can see, there's a bunch of wires behind me, but we did have to do some custom electronics as well. And even though I'm an electrical engineer, I hadn't done that since I was in school. And so I had
Hmm.
to kind of learn how to, design a CCB and do all that part as well. But I loved it all. It was all kind of this snowball effect of, hey, learning stuff and applying it is a lot of fun. And so it was easy for me. This is not work for me. This is fun.
Yeah. Well, constant learning, right? And I
Yeah.
think being a constant learner and not being afraid to, I think this speaks to a lot of, producers and people in music also, like, especially as people on the other side, like the more engineer minded people like yourself, is not being afraid to be like, I don't know how to do this thing, but I'm gonna figure it out and I'm gonna make it happen.
Yeah.
That's how half of my friends that produce music and win Grammys, that's kind of where they started. Was, I don't know, microphone goes into computer somehow. Sure. And then now they're like, winning Grammys and medals and stuff. So yeah, I don't know. It's the I will figure this out. Just give me time.
Yeah. And I think what's so hard about that? Why isn't everybody doing that? And by the way, a lot of people are. I think there are times where you get stuck and it's
Mm-hmm.
frustrating and you're thinking, why am I doing this? This sucks. It's just kind of teaching yourself to get through those periods so that you can enjoy the rest of it.
No, 100%. So, dude,
Yeah.
I'm amazed at all of this stuff. How often are you guys adding new pieces for the people that are interested in this as well?
Yeah, we do maybe it kind of ebbs and flows. But we've done two Tiegler's out of Germany. We've done two of their units
Yeah.
recently. So I'd say once every 3 months or so, but that may accelerate. Sometimes we have to
Hmm.
go off and do a whole plug-in redesign, like for the summing unit. And during those times, we are not able to add as much devices. But
Sure.
overall average, maybe once every 3 months or so, we add a device.
Man, that's incredible. That's actually faster than I would have expected. I would have expected
Yeah,
maybe two a year.
yeah. We learned early on that adding a device, that process, we needed to really optimize that. Like, how can we do
Hmm.
this as quickly and simply as possible with as little work as possible? Some of it, obviously the physical robotics, you can't get around that. But there's a
Yeah.
lot of the system that is common for all the devices, and so we've just designed it so that we can add a device. The actual work involved in adding a device is about a week and a half, roughly. Uh, and the main parts there are the physical part and then the graphics in the plugin. We have to create those custom graphics.
Yeah.
And
And then
other than that,
testing.
the rest,
I'm sure there's a rigorous testing process for all that stuff as well.
yeah, yeah.
What are some pieces that you're like, you don't have, but you're like, I'm gonna get those one day?
There's the Chandler Limited EQ that we always aspire for, the massive passive kind of related device.
Yeah, the
Can't
Chandler
remember
version of the massive passive. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, we like that.
It's a good one.
God, now I'm drawing a blank. There's been so many people that have suggested so many awesome things. Oh, one big one is a real plate reverb. Um,
Oh, wow. That would be incredible, actually. I've never even thought
yeah,
about like that kind of stuff. Yeah, that would be amazing.
yeah. So the one we want to do is called an EMT 140, and it's the Abbey Road one, and it's got
Hmm.
a big history. And they're out
Yeah,
there, and we have a partner that has one that we could do fairly quickly because we have it's in our partner's possession, and he's willing to put it in the service. But we're trying to figure out what I really would like is for it to be here, and you might be able to tell I'm in a basement. Can't get that thing in here. So an
yeah,
EMT
yeah,
140 is
yeah,
a
yeah.
8 foot by
They're not
4
tiny. They're not tiny.
foot. Yeah. So I don't know if we might do it at another location, like we've talked about, like we
Okay,
did with Sweden. We could do it in another location, and then the other thing is just go for a different plate reverb that's a little bit more manageable. These are all things
for
we have
sure.
to figure out.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Would you have to do anything? That's a massive unit. Golly, that's just like thinking about the logistics of that. Like, would there have to be new infrastructure made on your end to accommodate something as large as something like that plate? Because I feel
Yeah,
like I
actually,
haven't even I've seen a picture of what one of those looks like, but I don't know what controlling that looks like.
yeah, it's got this thing at the top that you turn to dampen to
Hmm.
control the dampening, and that's really the only main control on it is just the dampening. So we've sorted out that we could robotically control that.
Yeah.
I think the bigger issue is that starts to introduce a device that has ambient audio that
Hmm.
goes out into the room, and then of course the room audio goes into the device. So we would have to create a barrier of isolation there. That would
Yeah,
be
you
a
would
big
have to create individual isolation rooms for, especially those like, more open reverb units like that are not just like a digital rack version. Um,
yeah, right. And so the same thing comes up when we talk about guitar amps because we could do guitar amps, but miking a guitar amp and now you've got to isolate that audio. And
mhm.
um, somebody has suggested we could just do the guitar head and then go into a load device that has different
Yeah,
speaker simulations.
like a two
There's,
notes. Yeah.
yeah, so we're thinking about some of that stuff.
That's a great idea, actually. And that would open you up to pedal combinations as well, because you could have like a massive pedal board with all of your pedal combinations being able to link in and out of each other, and then essentially build your own pedal board
Yeah,
into
so we're
your own head cab.
we're very interested in that. We're already going down the path of creating some pedal options. On the pedals, the problem we're solving is less of a price problem or a money problem. We're solving almost a convenience problem. If somebody
Hmm.
just had access to a bunch of pedals like you described, and they didn't have to reamp and plug it in and deal with the physical aspect of getting a pedal into their mix, it seems like a pretty good product.
Well, sometimes for me as a producer, so I love a good guitar pedal. I don't own a lot of them, but I have friends that own a lot of them. But for me, it's a lot of times I'll go to a session and we'll be like, man, I wish I had this sound. And in my mind, I'm like, I know exactly how to get that sound, but I am missing like 3 pedals to get that sound. You know what I mean? Like it's a very, sometimes pedals do very specific things a lot of the time. Obviously, you can
Yeah,
kind of get around it with some tweaking, but like if you hear a sound in your head and you know exactly what makes that sound, it would be more convenient to be able to just like go do that thing
right. That's
rather
right.
than me have to like constantly carry around a freaking sack of pedals with me to every session and just hope that I'm going to use 2 of them.
Right. Yeah. And just the massive quantity of pedals that are out there were just overwhelming.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, it's crazy. When you start getting into the boutique world, and then you also have that's just gonna that explodes even more. I have a friend that makes pedals here named Cody. He works under Westminster Effects, and they make like some really interesting stuff here. A lot of drives and like more in the church world, like the post rock and like church pedal world. That's kind of like their thing.
Okay.
But like same for them. It's like there are so many cool people that I know like him that are constantly creating new things, and to stay on top of all that, that could become like you would need a whole warehouse just of pedals sitting on the floor.
I know we've kind of realized that we're trying to do our first cut on the pedals, and we're like, which ones do we pick? And then of course there's a
Yeah.
million opinions, and we're just trying to get the concept down, just try to figure out how to do
Yeah.
a pedal thing. So hopefully sometime soon.
No, that would be very cool. And I would also love to see something like because you guys don't have a Shadow Hills, do you?
We don't. Yeah, that's a big
I
one
didn't
that's been
see it.
requested.
I would kill to have a Shadow Hills compressor at Shadow Hills mastering unit limiter at my beck and call, because so at the studio that I worked out of in Charlotte, they had one of those in their mastering room, and so I mastered a handful of records on it when I was there, and it just does something so special, man, and I love it and I miss it, and it is incredibly expensive piece of gear.
Yeah.
It's the thing that is the piece of gear that when people who aren't like in the music gear, production gear side of things, they're like, well, how expensive could it be? You know what I mean? That is the piece of gear that I point them to. Of like,
Yeah.
this is like almost a year's salary for one piece of gear.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes it gets really. I think the poster child for how expensive gear is the Fairchild.
Yeah, the
Um,
Fairchild is another one. Yeah.
so
Which
that's
obviously
those use.
that would goal, right? That's a big goal.
It is. Yeah. We've looked at them for a long time and used their. I don't know. Years ago they were 45,000. They're probably over
Yeah.
60,000 now.
Yeah, I
And
know, man.
there is somebody who has bought the rights to that name, and they're starting to produce them again. But even brand
Really?
new, they're
I
yeah,
didn't
they're in
realize that.
yeah, for some reason brand new. Instead of being at a reasonable price, they're up in that price range somewhere. I can't figure out why they're charging that much, but
Because they can probably.
I guess
It's a name thing. It's a name thing. Um so okay, I think this is a really good place to talk about like future goals for you guys. Obviously, you have, you know, the new pieces of gear you'd like to get. I can hear the little yink, 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 the little
I
piece
was
of
wondering
gear
if you could
turning in the
hear it.
background. Yeah, I can hear it. That's awesome. Like what would be some other goals that you guys see kind of looking into the future a little bit? Obviously, accruing some new pieces of gear is, an ever growing part of the business. But outside of that, we talked about some of the guitar stuff. Is there some other things that you guys have thought about for the future?
We hit a lot of them: guitar pedals, guitar amps, and we've just done the summing thing, so that one's out of the way. The reverb is another area. Um, Echo type things, plates or echoes or anything in that world that is a pain to own, but it would be
Mm-hmm.
lovely to have it in a service like this. And then finally, we think a lot about old analog synthesizers, and how to make those accessible. So we put a lot of thought into that.
Oh man, speaking my language. That's a good one. I didn't even think about synths. Yeah, synths would be an incredible. I don't even know. So just spitballing, how would you do that? Like, how would you even replicate? Because you wouldn't have the ability to put MIDI information and send MIDI information. So would you have to create a velocity based key pusher to physically get
We could
hands
do that if it
on
was.
some of those units?
Yeah, I guess there's different classes of units in that world. There are ones that are old
Yeah.
enough to where there's no MIDI input at all. It is just a synthesizer,
Yeah.
physical synthesizer. And
Yeah.
in that case, we would robotically control any knobs, and then we would have to actuate the keys in order to actually play the performance that comes
Mm-hmm.
through from the MIDI input. So we're assuming there's MIDI input into our plugin. We would have some sort of MIDI version of our plugin.
Sure.
So there's that class, and then there is a class I think that has MIDI input, but
Yes.
the rest of it, all the sound generation and all of that, is analog. So then we would use the MIDI input that it has and not have to at
Yeah.
least actuate the performance. And we may or may not have to robotically control the knobs. It depends on if they're parameterized
Yeah.
through MIDI or not.
True. Yeah. No, because when you get into the synth world, some of that stuff is like half and half, and some of it's like some of it's software controlled. Sometimes I know there are like brain units where you can control the entirety of the brain digitally through like MIDI or whatever, or through, some other variation of their own control plugin or something. I know that exists as well. But then you have, like your Moogs that are the classic, like, plug a MIDI and you have all the controls on the face, and even having access to those would be incredible.
Yeah, there's the use case part of it of the person would not be able to perform with the cloud sound generation. There's just too much latency. So they would have to record their track with some local sound and then convert that to this cloud synthesizer as they play the MIDI track through the cloud. And we've gotten mixed, feedback on whether that's feasible, because once you change the sound, you want to change the performance. So there's that whole thing going on.
Yeah.
I know that a lot of people don't. Yeah. There are people that don't play their performances. They program them through the computer. And so for those people, it makes a lot more sense. They just loop with some local sound if they want to start with, and then they just start looping with our sounds, and then, they can continue doing what they do.
So a good place in my mind that would actually be a good place to start with, in that would actually be drum machines first.
Oh, yeah.
Rather than synths, because they are normally just on-off situations. There's not a lot of velocity to older drum machines. It's sequencing more so.
And you would say the majority of people program those, not play them.
Exactly, because it's less. There's less velocity involved. It's more just note on, note off in a sequence pattern.
Okay.
At least in my mind. But that's just a spitballing right now. I'm just interested in, like, you guys, like, in the future, like, there's so many possibilities going forward. So if people are interested, as we kind of close this up, Chris, I mean, we're already getting to the hour mark, man. That was a super fast conversation. That was incredible. Closing in on this, if people want to check you guys out, obviously they can go to accessanalog.com. What social medias are you guys very active on? And is there a way that they can check some of this stuff out?
Yeah, Facebook and Instagram, we're on there, Access Analog. Lots of pictures of robotics and videos of robotics moving and fun stuff like that. We do some contests through there. Remember, we do some contests, plus we do sometimes we just like, hey, for this weekend, the Massive Passive is free. So we'll do some of those types of fun things.
Do you guys normally announce new gear on Instagram as well? Yeah,
that's definitely. And then our email list as well. We sometimes send out coupons through those channels. And then just the initial sign up is just go to accessanalog.com and just create the free account. And like I said, download the free plugin and connect and just use some of the free gear and just kind of get a feel for it.
Thank you so much, Chris, for coming on the podcast today to talk about everything Access Analog. And if you want to try out Access Analog, go to accessanalog.com and pick out one piece of gear that you'd like to try out. Use the coupon trial-HSH at checkout, and you will be able to use that for free. This is excluding mastering change. This is one free reservation of a piece of gear for you guys to check out. So go use that. If you could take the time to like, subscribe. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other audio platform, go ahead and make sure you're subscribed, and also leave a rating and a review. It helps the show get out to new people, and we're trying to grow every single week. Once again, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Home Studio Hangout podcast, and we'll see you next week.